welcome everyone to this Four Pees Café. A special welcome to Dietrich.
Hello.
Callas and from Berlin.
I'm hitting the admit button. Yeah, hello everybody from Berlin.
The cafe today is is about pdfToolbox 13.1. That is also why Dietrich is joining us. I will gladly let him do most of the talk and the demonstration and only contribute a little to it. A little bit of housekeeping just to remind those of you who might not have been here before. This is a cafe, which means that you can normally unmute yourself in the control panel that you have from Zoom. There is also a chat possibility in there. So if you have questions, feel free to unmute and speak up. We would appreciate the interaction. So that is not a problem at all. If you feel more comfortable typing something, then enter your question in the chat window and we will keep an eye on that and answer you either during the presentation at the end or afterwards. This is a cafe, which also means that it is recorded. I think you got a nice GDPR message about that probably. The recording will be available in our YouTube channel once it has been edited, and that typically takes a few days. And of course, you know or should know that all the other Four Pees cafes, the recordings of those are still on YouTube. There is a special playlist for the cafes, so you probably have 50 or 60 hours of video by now. If you don't know what to do during the weekend or it's bad weather, then just a suggestion. So let's get started with this one. And actually, instead of talking about pdfToolbox 13.1, I want to do a little bit of marketing for something that is coming up. And that is also a callas organized event, namely a PDF camp event. You have a slide for that, Dietrich?
I am.
Because I don't know the details by heart.
Yeah, I need to. Yeah, okay.
So you see it there on screen. That is a small part of Berlin that you see there. Just to say that upcoming is a PDF camp event. PDF camp events are hackathons, and what that means is that you go there, you bring whatever question you might have encountered in production, for example, or whatever problem you're trying to solve in production that has to do with PDF or with callas technology. And you throw that into the group. We try to find a number of people who are interested in the same type of problem, and then we see how far we can get in solving that. Either just solve it outright with pdfToolbox or PDFA pilot or PDF chip, whatever it is, or go as far as we can and maybe come up with a number of feature requests for callas to improve the product. So if you have not done that, it's a lot of fun. It is typically a small group of people together with people from callas. I will be there as well. And it's a 2-day event. We start somewhere around 10, 11 in the morning the first day. So you should be able to still travel to Berlin in the morning if you prefer. And then we end relatively early in the afternoon the second day, so that you can still travel home the second day if you want to do that. If you're interested, check it out. It is on the callas software website under events. You'll have more details there. You'll also have the location where it goes through. You can see that already on the little map there. So check it out and register. There are a few spaces still open there. So that for pdfCamp, and then I think we can get started with the main dish for today, which is pdfToolbox 13.1.
Yep.
You're in charge, Dietrich. There
I
you
know,
go.
I know.
So this is still me, and I will put a different hat on for change, the hat from the Gantour group. If you don't know that, I'm also executive director of the Gantour group at the moment. And the Gantour group a little while ago came out with a new version of the specifications. So there was a GWG 2015 specification that has been around for a long time, since 2015. And so new specifications were just released. And then the first question I typically get is, why would you release new specifications? What was wrong with the old ones? I think there are two parts to the answer this time. It's always different, of course, but when we look at what happened now, there are two parts to the answer. And the first one is that technology changes. That is something that you also see with software. You have different versions of operating systems. You have different versions of software that have different capabilities. And so the standards that we use in our daily life have to keep up with those changes. And that is not always a bad thing. It's not always because things don't work anymore that we have to update standards. Sometimes, and that is the case now as well, it is because there is new software out that has new capabilities, and we want to be able to take advantage of that. And when I talk about what has changed, you will see that that as well. And then the second part, and this was very well specific to our organization, to the Gantour group itself, is that the specifications have kind of organically grown over a long time. We started to get to a group around 2000, 2001, 2002. That means that the specification texts and the way that we presented the specs have survived for about 20 years, but we felt that it was necessary to change the format. You will see how it looks a little bit in what Dietrich will talk about later. We felt it was necessary to change the format, but also, and maybe more importantly, we felt it was necessary to also change some of the way that the specification was written and professionalize it a little bit, standardize it a little bit more on the PDF standard itself, make sure that it was more clear and easy for people to implement. So, what has changed in these specifications? Well, you can see it there on one slide. I've tried to summarize it a little bit here, and I will go over it very quickly. There was a cafe session 2 weeks ago, I think, specifically on the topic of GWG 2022. So if you want to hear more details, then you can watch the video of that event as well. But very quickly, there was a consolidation of the variants. As you probably know, Gantour Group has a variant per market segment or type of technology. For example, there is one for LFP, there is one for digital print. And for the 2015 specifications, these were released over a long period of time. And as a result, they were not completely the same. There were some small differences. And in this round of specs, we standardized all of them. We consolidated all of them in a single document so that there is less confusion. The second part, and that is an interesting part if you have not heard about it, and then I would I would urge you to read a little bit more about it, but there is an ISO standard called processing steps that is meant to provide standardization for certain elements in a PDF file, mainly used in packaging and label at the moment. The best example is the cut line or the die cut that you need, and where metadata on layers is used to be able to identify where those elements are in a PDF. Before that, if you don't use processing steps, you would have to do something with spot color names, for example, and that becomes difficult to standardize. And if it's difficult to standardize something, it's difficult to automate. And so processing steps is a standard, an ISO standard that allows that standardization using metadata for layers. And the Gantt group specifications now take advantage of that for the label and packaging variants. The third part, and this is also something that Dietrich will come back on a little bit later, is the reduction of false positives. When I said that new software has new capabilities and brings new possibilities to the table, this is the perfect example. We now have pre-flight software that is capable of detecting which objects are going to cause a production problem and which are probably not going to cause a production problem. Best example and the simplest example is if an object is completely invisible, then it is not going to cause a real production problem, even though it might violate one of the rules. It's invisible, so you're not going to print it, you're not going to see it. So in many cases, you can simply ignore it. For automation, this is super important because every time you find something in a file that fails pre-flight, you have to pull that file from the automated flow and someone has to look at it. And that is what you want to avoid. The GWG 2022 specifications allow software that has technology to detect false positives to actually also use it. And Dietrich will come back on that. As I said on the previous slide, the specification format itself has changed quite a bit as well. It is no longer a Word document, but it's now in the form of a spreadsheet. But it has also been formalized with unique IDs, with version numbers to make it easier to implement and mainly also to make it easier to maintain in the future, both for us who write it at the Gantt group and for vendors like Callas to implement it.
Agreed.
It was necessary. Yeah, I think you agree with that as well.
True.
And then there were a few smaller changes. I am not going to go into all of those, but again, Dietrich will have an example of what that meant for 13.1 of pdfToolbox, for example. So just to finish this up, these new specifications are available on the Gantt group website. There is some documentation that explains what has changed in a little bit more detail than here. And there is also a document for implementers. So if you happen to be on the software development side and you want to know what this new format is and what the details are, there is a PDF document on the Gantt group website that you can download and that has that information in it as well. Good.
Cool. I guess then we are really at pdfToolbox 13.1, and the core of the new features of pdfToolbox 13.1 definitely are the new Dwg profiles. I'm pretty sure that's the first implementation of the new variants of the new GW specification. So since you probably are a user of pdfToolbox, you could be one of the first people in the world who actually use these new specifications. You will find them in pdfToolbox 13.1 in the library prepress color and transparency. There is a new group, GWG 2022, which are the variants, actually 34th, new profiles representing what David just said, the variants and the packaging variants specifically. Each of them comes with 6 different product types. So you can see that probably here. Packaging Flexo, for instance, could be for the product corrugated box, corrugated display, and so forth. So for the 3 packaging variants, packaging Flexo, packaging gravure, and packaging offset, you have 6 different product types. So all in all, you have 34 new profiles. And we will have a look at a few of them later on, just for the ones of you who still want to use the old specifications. We all know standards always need some time until they are really used. They are also still there. But in order to make it clear where they are, we renamed the group to DWG 2015. So they are still there. And let me also mention here, David already said there is processing steps, the standard. And what DWG requires us to do is to do a full processing steps validation in the packaging variants only, of course. So in the packaging variants, we've just included all the processing steps validation checks. We have implemented a processing steps validation profile right after that ISO standard came out. And as is our habit, whenever there's a new standard, we try to be quick with implementing it into our solutions, as we have done right now. So before I want to introduce you a little bit into the profiles and into the internals, I also want to explain a little bit about how they have been created, because, and that is very much related to what David has said. So it makes our lives as implementers much easier, because this is not just, it's not a text that you would read, it's a structured information, and we can, for us, it's much easier to use structured information in order to somehow translate it into software. The DWG specification is a number of tables, actually, a spreadsheet, and 2 of them were more important than the others for us in the implementation. One is the requirements table, and the requirements table lists all the different requirements that a variant could use. Not all of the requirements are used in every variant, but all requirements that are used in any of the variants is listed here. So what we have done is we had to understand each of the requirements. We had to create a profile, a check for each of the requirement. In some cases, a requirement ended up in 2 checks or so, or 2 requirements were combined. But in general, it's just one requirement has been implemented as one check. And then it was possible for us, or what we did, we just implemented one master profile, one single profile that has all the checks, all the requirements translated into checks. And then we were using variables in this, what we call, or what you could call master profile here. We introduce variables in order to make it possible to switch a certain check on or off, or to specify thresholds, let's say for image resolution or so. Yeah. And then in order to make your life as a user also easier, for each of the checks, in the comments, you will find a direct reference to the specification. So here we have a requirement, overprint pure black text. And then this has been transformed into a check, a pdfToolbox check, black small text below 12 point, which already is a threshold. So a concrete implementation for a particular variant. But it's a check, and then in the check you will find that this check goes back to the requirement 9 of the specifications. So then it's easy for you to find out, okay, why is the check there? And then if you want to read the explanation text in the specification. The other table that was important is the variance table. The variance table specifies, I don't know whether, let's look at this requirement 9 here, which is supposed to be a warning in magazine ads, and the threshold here, meaning the maximum, the minimum size of a text to be taken into account is 12 point. Yeah, so we see all the thresholds and whether or not a check, a requirement has to be used in a variant in this table. And then we, since this already is a table and the information is nicely structured, it was quite easily to transform all that information into an array of variables. And this array or value set for the variables could then be used in order to transform the master profile that we created before into a certain GWG, a particular GWG profile. So that was pretty much straightforward. And then in order to create or to provide, be able to provide you with these profile, our engine just went or has to go over all the value sets in a loop and create a static profile for each of them. And this is now a more or less automatic process, let's say semi-automatic. So if David or DWG would decide tomorrow to create a new variant or something, or change some of the values here and there, it would be a matter of minutes for us to create new static profiles. I guess that's that.
It will not be tomorrow, by the way.
Not tomorrow, okay. Then let's have a look. I have a file here, and as I've said, I need to go to pre-press color transparency. I don't need default. And I have my GWG 2022 profiles here, and then I can use them. So let's start with, I have a PDF file here open in my PDF toolbox, and then let's just use magazine ads CMYK. I can analyze the file as usual, and then it comes up with some results. Nothing spectacular here. There is some RGB in it, ICC-based RGB, as we can see here. There is the crop box doesn't match the media box. There's a warning about potentially insufficient image resolution, 149 to 224. That is what GWG says are the values, the thresholds for magazine ads. And then there is some registration color inside of the page area. And that is because in this case, the bleed box is bigger than the cut mark. So nothing really spectacular here. And I also want to show you one of the packaging profiles here, which is packaging Flexo and Leaflet, because Leaflet seems to be most appropriate for this PDF file. So let's do that. And then we have basically the same information here. Interestingly, the insufficient image resolution has a different threshold, and that is because it was just created with a different value set. So instead of 200, what was it, 24 or so, we have 239. And then the other thing that is new, there is a new hit here that the file doesn't have processing steps metadata. And that is because we have integrated the processing steps metadata validation profile. Yeah, and then GWG specification says every PDF file for packaging needs to have processing steps metadata. And lastly, I want to demonstrate this profile because it is also somehow a special large format. Because if you click on here, it comes up with a dialog. So this is the only profile that still uses variables. All the others had been using variables before they were created and put into the software. They are now static. But for large format, there is a requirement that a scaling factor and a viewing distance need to be taken into account for checking. And if a PDF page doesn't already specify a scaling factor in the user unit, then a dialog needs to show up and the user is asked for the scaling factor. So let's say this file is supposed to be printed scaled by 10, and the viewing distance, that is the typical distance that a user would have when viewing the result, let's say is 5 meters. And then if we run the profile, GWG says RGB is not an issue here, the crop box issue remains, and then we have insufficient image resolution with a much higher threshold. And that is because the scaling factor, of course, of 10 scales the PDF page a lot, and that reduces the image resolution, the effective image resolution. And then if we just play a little bit, and then let's say we keep the scaling factor, but instead of 5 meters, we say people are typically farther away from the printed result, then we still have 2 matches. The threshold is far below, so it's 50% of what we have seen before, and only 2 of the images are still problematic, considered to be problematic. And if we go even further and say, okay, we scale by 10, but the typical viewing distance, let's say, is 20, then we don't have any issues with the images at all anymore. Yeah, so that should explain a little bit how this large format profile works. Okay. As David had said, in case of any question, questions, just ask. Otherwise, I move on. This is what you get with pdfToolbox 13.1, 34 new profiles according to GWG specifications. In order to make that possible, on our way to there, we didn't just have to implement an engine that gives us these profiles in an as automatic as possible way. We also had to do a few adjustments to the engine itself. And I want to introduce you to those right now. First, there are 2 new properties. All the other checks could be used with what already was there, but 2 new properties, 2 new types of checks were required. And that is because of the rich black text requirement, which says that a text shall not have a black color component larger than or equal to threshold A. So this is the text from the requirement. I've just copied it from the requirement. So it must not have a black color component larger than or equal to A if the sum of all process color components for that text element is larger than B. So for magazine ads, a black color component needs to be below the black color component of a text needs to be below 85% if the process color ink is above 280%. And then in order to make that possible, we needed to have an ink amount property that allows us to limit that check to process color only. It was possible to check ink amount for objects for all colorants, including spot colors, but not for process colors only. And for that reason, we needed to implement these two new properties. And that is actually the only reason why you could not fully use the new profile in pdfToolbox 13.0. So you will need to use pdfToolbox 13.1 just because of these two new properties that aren't available in previous versions. It's really a detail from the requirements point of view, but of course the engine wouldn't understand the profile.
Let me just add, Dietrich, that on the if you think that this requirement text is very difficult to read and hard to understand, then in a way you're correct. It is very formalistic. You can see that it refers to these things with a unique ID starting with a D in front of it, which are definitions. The purpose is not that normal people would read this. This is really written for someone who understands standards and the PDF standard and so on. And it is really written for the people who have to implement these requirements in software. And if you want to get the same result, if 5 different software vendors read this text and then implement it in software, then you have to be very, very accurate and very exact, and there can't be any room for interpretation. And so it naturally becomes quite hard to read. So if you want to participate in this process, the Gantt Work Group always invites people to participate. Most of the discussions are actually more interesting than what you finally get in those few arcane sentences.
Yeah, I mean, I happily agree, and most probably also I have to agree that it seems to be written to people that are unnormal like me, because I found it actually very useful when working on the profiles and on the checks, because as you've said, they're pretty clear. Yeah. But yes, thanks for mentioning. The D things here are probably confusing. They refer to the definitions. Okay. Having that said, there is something that is even more important, which is completely under the hood. An improvement in our engine, specifically in the Sifter engine, or closely related to the Sifter engine, or what is also called context-aware object detection. As David has said, one of the new things about the new Dwg profiles is the goal to reduce false positives, because they're kind of a stumble block in automation. And for many, so there are various ways or various means by which false positives are reduced, and many of them use context-aware object detection, because for many of these things you need to take into account not just the object itself, but also how that object relates to other objects on the same page, mostly whether it is in front or just next to it. Yeah, and I've written down here all the means that we use in order to reduce false positives. First, there are the overprinting or knockout checks for white or black objects, and they are only relevant if the object I'm currently checking is overlapping another object. If that black object is not properly set to overprint, but if it's just in front of the white background of the page, then it doesn't really matter. So you will have to check whether that black object is in front of another object and whether that other object is not also black. And in order to do so, you need to check that object in context with another object, which means in our technology, in our engine, you'll have to use Sifter. Same, and here for the next two things, I need to differentiate between packaging and non-packaging profiles. For non-packaging profiles, in various requirements, GWU specifications allow us to disregard invisible objects. So if an object is on the page, but is covered by another object, we don't have to report it. We could, I mean, GWG here says, okay, this is up to the implementer, whether he decides to report it or not. We've decided to not report invisible objects, and our checks use Sifter in order to determine whether a particular object is visible or not. And then, and that is not very new, another way to get rid of false positives is to ignore any objects that are out of the bleed box. For packaging profiles, it's even more complicated. For packaging profiles, there is no easy way to say, where is my print surface? Where for a rectangular print that is determined by the bleed box, for instance, for a box, a folded box, that will be determined by the die line and not by any rectangular box, but the die line that tells the cutting machine where to cut the finally used part of the paper. Yeah, so what we need to do is, and actually this is also a requirement coming from processing steps. What we need to do is we need to determine whether an object is within print surface, and print surface usually is determined by the die line. There is a fallback actually in processing steps, but in most commonly you could, as a first approach, say it's determined by the die line. And secondly, for packaging profiles, you would want to exclude any objects that are on processing steps layers. So for instance, if there would be a line width check, you wouldn't want to check the die line because it doesn't really matter, because it's nothing you would actually print. Yeah, so you would want to ignore the legend, for instance, that you have on many packages, because it's just an explanation. It doesn't really, it isn't really print content, yeah, or the embossing or whatsoever, yeah. So we would want to exclude any objects on processing steps layers. And finally, what you would also want to do in all of the profiles, you would want to ignore any objects that are initially invisible through layers, because they are not going to be printed. And that has all been implemented. And that also means that the results, the checks, are somehow complex. So let's have a look. I would just want to show you two of the checks, and I'm going to my library here, because in the library, in the prepress library, they are locked, and then it's not so easy to have a look. So here we see the magazine ads profile with all the checks in it, and you also see, as indicated by the icon, what on the first level is the property, or to which group the property belongs. And you can see that, as I've said, the majority here of the checks uses Sifter. Yes, the Sifter icon here indicates that this check uses Sifter. And if we look at this one, black small text below 12 point using the device CMYK not set to overprint, with OPM1. We don't have to think too much about it, but it's again our requirement 9 here. And then if we open that for editing, we see that on the first level, this indeed checks whether the object is visible. Yeah, so if only if the object is visible, then we would get a hit. And then it would not take all of the objects into account. It would only take objects into account that apply or that conform to our checks here. The next level check, which happens to be yet another sifter check. Yeah, this again uses sifter because this is, as I've said, a black text not set to overprint check. Yeah, so this second level sifter check again uses a filter to find objects that are black text and below 12 point and so forth, but only if these objects are in front of another object that is not pure black nor white. Yeah, only if it's in front of an object that is not pure black or white, only then that is a problem. Yeah, and if I then go into that filter, then we are finally there where the typical conditions are present for our check here. So object uses black only is true, text size is less than 12 point. Device gray is covered by another check, so we are not interested in that here. We are only interested in device CMYK. And then there is one that checks whether that object is set to overprint or is not set to overprint. And this uses include other check because there are 3 different error conditions here. Is overprint enabled for fill could not be true, overprint enabled for stroke could not be true, or Illustrator overprint mode could not be true. Yeah, and then we use fire if any condition is met in order to get a hit or to take this object into account if one of them hits. And ultimately, there is a thing that I've mentioned. It has to be visible through layers. So we only want to get a hit if it's not invisible through layers, which means it either is in the default OCCD technicalities, but it just means it's on a layer, but the layer is initially visible, or it doesn't belong to a layer at all. Yeah? You can immediately forget it. Again, all the details that I've mentioned. What I want you to understand is that these checks are quite complex and that they use sifter technology quite a lot in order to reduce the number of false positives. Yeah, and similarly, I also want to mention this for packaging Flexo, and since we've used the leaflet before, we use the corresponding check here. Just to mention here are all the processing steps checks from the processing steps profile, and you can also say here you have a different reference, so it doesn't refer, of course, to the GWG. It refers to the processing steps ISO standard, but that is just a side note. We wanted to have a look into this one, black small text, blah, 12 point. And here, other than for the non-packaging check, we start also with sifter, but not with visibility. We start with a sifter check that determines whether the black object is within print surface. So whether the black object is within die line. And then from there on, the structure is the same as for the packaging, for the non-packaging check. Yeah, so it's only on the first level that the 2 checks are different. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, so for those of you who have had training from me at one point, and you wonder why I say that you should not probably create your own checks, but if you can duplicate checks that already exist in the standard libraries, this is the reason. It can get quite complex, and it's very easy to forget to add conditions that would give you the result that you want. So if you can copy something that is already there, then please do so.
Unfortunately, I was not in a position to do so when starting my work here, or forgot your advice, but whatever. Maybe we also mentioned that before that Sifter is not a quick thing. Yeah, it's powerful, but for a computer, it's much faster to check object by object than to look at an object and take other objects that are also around also into account, so that you can probably understand that you immediately add lots of performance stuff to the engine, because you have to take into account which combinations you also already have analyzed, and you have to analyze many combinations. So what we implemented for 13.1 is caching. Up until 13.1, when you would use, let's say, the visible check in two, so the sifter check that only takes objects into account that are visible, if you would use that in two different checks in the same profile, the engine would run that sifter thing twice. That is not the case in 13.1 anymore. In 13.1, the results of the first sifter checks are saved, are cached, and then used throughout the profile. That only makes sense or only gives you an advantage if you're using the same kind of sifter check, obviously. So, but since we are using the visibility thing, or for packaging, the print surface thing, all around, almost over all the different checks, it gives us a huge performance boost for the Dwg profiles. From that point of view, I could say, okay, you could use these profiles in 13.02. However, they will run much faster and quicker in 13.1. And another thing, and that is really more a side note here, the sifter thing is, I think, a real progress also for you. If you in your own profiles want to limit stuff to only visible objects, that is much more doable with 13.1 than before. And then the other thing that we are using here is the ability that we introduced, I believe, also with 13.0 to hide checks. So all of the inner checks of the Dwg profiles are hidden. So you wouldn't see them in the list of single checks here. Yeah. Okay, that's GWG. And that's my first part.
Cool. Something else than pdfToolbox for, again, because this is also something that happened along the way, and I thought it was important enough to at least mention that that happened as well. And that is that if you're using Switch and you go to the InFocus App Store, you would see that there is now a PDF chip app in the App Store as well. If you don't know what PDF chip is, but you know what pdfToolbox is, then you actually do know what PDF chip is. PDF chip is a technology that is used in the HTML to PDF pre-flight report, so the custom PDF report in pdfToolbox. It's the technology that is used for the tiling functionality. It's a technology that is used for place content and place barcode and all these other things. So it's the engine that converts HTML to PDF. What pdfChip does, it's a separate standalone, it's a standalone application that is a CLI application only, so there is no user interface, and it can create documents from scratch. In pdfToolbox, the technology was packaged in such a way that it's used to decorate existing PDF files. In pdfChip, you can create PDF files from scratch. And so, as an example, we have a customer that gets XML information from an accounting from accounting software, and they use pdfChip to convert that into proper PDF invoices, which is not as simple as it sounds, because the invoices are quite complex and they are multiple pages sometimes, and you can't predict ahead of time how many pages. So there is a lot of stuff that needs to be done to make that look nice. The difficulty we had with that project when we implemented it was that we had to run pdfChip from Switch, and there was no way to easily do that. And so now Callas created an app for that. In the past, it would probably have been a configurator, but the new way to run things in Switch is through the use of apps. And so you can see on screen there the Callas pdfChip app as part of the InFocus App Store. So if you want to try that, go there, download it. It is a free app, of course. You would still need a license for pdfChip, but there are trial licenses for that. So you could see how that works. There's good documentation for it that explains how it all works. So it should be very easy to get going with.
Okay. Thanks. Now we are vector element optimizations or trim clipped vector path. This is a new fix-up. Unrelated to DWG, but new in pdfToolbox 13.1. Background is that sometimes vector paths are clipped away by something, and then you don't see them, but they're still there, and that might confuse steps in the workflow behind. If you export a die line, it might still be present in the result die line, and then the cutter would cut your paper even there where you haven't seen the die line before. So it would be useful to be able to trim that die line where it is, for instance, clipped away by a clipping path from X object B box or so. And then for that, there is a new fix-up in pdfToolbox, trim clipped vector path. And I want to show that briefly. I would use this very same file that we've used before, but a different library. This one. And my PDF file here has a trim box. I hope that you can see that here. There is a green trim box. And if you can't see that yet, I changed that. I will just show you my fix-up. Remove vector paths outside of trim box or bleed box or whatsoever. And I could also say a custom box, and then the dialog will use what we introduced with pdfToolbox 13.0. It will allow me to specify a box based off of an offset to, let's say, the trim box and the width and the height of my custom box, or I can use offsets to the edges of the trim box. So these methods for specifying custom boxes are available here as well, but let's just use the trim box. And if we apply this to our file, then it will cut any objects that go beyond the trim box away. And so that you believe me that this really has gone, we can nicely use the wireframe view and just switch text shadings, and images off. Then we see that all the vector objects are only within trimbox. Yeah, so that should prove what I have said. Okay. Let's move on.
Yes, very small item, but it combines kind of two of my favorite things that have been implemented lately. So it's important enough to mention. If you used process plans or profiles or checks or fixes, if you create them, then you should know what test mode is. That is that button that says test at the bottom. It's kind of obvious. And this works great for testing, especially fix-ups and process plans and so on. So things that would normally modify the PDF. Yeah? It avoids the fact that you are testing and you overwrite your test document every time, and then you have to restart and you don't know what you're doing anymore because you don't know. Yeah. So it avoids that whole problem by giving you a test mode that's where pdfToolbox automatically copies your test file and it runs your process plan, for example, on that copy. So you don't have to save it somewhere. It can't be overwriting your original. It is absolutely fantastic. However, it was missing in the other favorite feature I had that was introduced in pdfToolbox 13, which is the replacement of the old style run list, so the old style and position configuration, by JavaScript. In pdfToolbox 13, Callas introduced the possibility to write JavaScript to do imposition, which works 1,500 times better than the old style stuff. Trust me, if you do something complex, then you should, with imposition, then you should look at this. It is going to make your life a whole lot better. But it was not so easy to test immediately there. And so what you can do now in 13.1 is also use test mode while you are writing the imposition scheme. And so that not only gives you the color coding that you now have and the code completion and everything else that you have in this editor in pdfToolbox, but you can even also run tests immediately there while you are writing it. And the combination of all those things is fantastic. So
thanks. Okay, that brings us to at least one of the last features, if not the last, I'm actually not sure. And that is transparency in place content. And that is an extension to the existing fix-up place content on page, and it allows you to deal with transparency in this context. So there are a number of new parameters here in place content on page, and that there are actually two use cases, two important use cases, I believe. The one easier to understand and more obvious, you could have some content and you want to place it in a transparent way. So instead of placing it opaque over your existing page content, you could say, okay, I want it to appear transparent so that the original PDF still shines through. But you could also use this new parameters to make sure that any transparency that is present in the content that you are placing does not interfere with what you have, so that it would indeed cover any existing content in an opaque way. So, and I thought that deserves some demonstration, and I tried to stick to the same PDF file that we were using before, and I have placed some PDF fix-up prepared here where there is a PDF file, basically just a green rectangle that I'm placing on my original PDF file. And if I don't use any of these features here, the current behavior, if I click on the test mode that David already has introduced, it would just place my green rectangle in front of my PDF page. So that's easy. What I could do right now, I could say, okay, instead of an opacity of 100, I will only use 50, in which case it will shine through. Yeah, so that is easy. And the other thing that I could do is, instead of constant alpha, I could use any of the blend modes. Let's use the multiply blend mode, and then it would create transparency, but in a slightly different way. Yeah, so that is all straightforward, I believe, and can be used. You could use this also with an HTML template or any of the other formats that you could use in place content. The other use case is maybe more difficult to understand, so that definitely also deserves an explanation. I have another template here, which looks pretty similar. David likes it much more because it uses purple a lot. But this actually came from support, and that was actually the reason for this implementation. Yeah. So if I would now say, okay, I want to place this normal without using any transparency, click on test, then, okay, I should probably use that other template. Then you will see that the light purple thing is indeed opaque, but the dark purple frame around it is transparent. And that is because that uses a strange blend mode screen. But it would in the same way be the case with any of the other transparency settings. It just is invisible if something is behind. Yeah, so if something is behind, the purple is not shown. That is what this blend mode does here, or more or less. So what you could do in order to avoid that, you can create an isolated transparency group when placing that content. And that means it will create something. These are PDF internals, but while we are at it, we can also explain it. A transparency group is created. And if the transparency group has the flag that it is isolated, then any of the transparency that is specified within that group doesn't interact with the backdrop of the whole thing. Transparency is still there, but it only works within the group, doesn't interact with its backdrop. Yeah. So if we go to isolate it here and test it, then the thing is placed as the same template is placed as before, but in this case, you will still see the dark purple frame. Yeah. So in yeah. Yeah. Okay. I guess that is what I wanted to demonstrate here, which means we can go back to our presentation. And yeah, there are more features. I like this one.
So a small point again, but for the people who need it, probably a big thing, I think. There is such a thing as license server. If you have not heard of it, license server allows you to easily also use pdfToolbox in environments where you would do auto scaling, for example, because it allows pdfToolbox to not do local activation of the software, but instead talk to license server, which is a separate application that runs somewhere centrally on your network. And so the license would come from license server rather than local activation. And if you don't have to activate locally anymore, in some contexts, that has a lot of advantages. Think of auto scaling in AWS, think of Docker, running it in Docker or Dockerized environments, and so on. However, there is a slight problem with that. And the problem is on the next slide. The problem is that the license server needs to be specified. If I run,
so if the problem is on the next slide, maybe we skip the next slide.
Yeah, but then we don't have, well, then we have the solution. So when I want to use license server, I have to run pdfToolbox, and I have to, on the command line or in switch, I have to specify where my license server is. And it's not just where my license server is, because if you want to have a rock solid environment, and you probably are running 3 license servers in a cluster and not just one. Yeah. And so in that case, you need to specify all 3 of them. The problem is, especially in Switch, is that that configuration is done on an element level. So in every flow where I use pdfToolbox, if I want to use license server, every time I use a pdfToolbox configurator in that flow, I would also have to specify the location of the license server or license servers. Now we can go to the solution, and the solution is very simple. There is support now for a small configuration file that needs to be called license server.txt, and it can live in the same location as the pdfToolbox license file. If that file is present, then pdfToolbox will automatically reach out to the license server, so you don't have to do it explicitly. And that means your CLI call can be unchanged when you start using license server, but pdfToolbox will read that configuration file and will automatically add the necessary parameters to reach out to the license server. The biggest change is for Switch users, because it means that you can just use pdfToolbox configurators as you otherwise would. And again, pdfToolbox will still reach out to license server. Yeah. What you have in that text file, you see an example there. There is also documentation for that, but you see an example there. It's very simple. You just specify either the IP address plus the port, if you're using a non-standard port, or you're specifying the network name of the system that is running license server. Very small thing, but I think if you are in the situation that you're using this, especially with Switch, it makes the difference between almost being unusable and being trivial to implement.
Yeah, which brings us to the business part of this presentation. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think there weren't any questions so far.
No.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, we sent out information that we plan to do a price increase on pdfToolbox, and we just said, okay, we shouldn't be silent about that in this cafe either. So, and we just want to provide a little bit of background and explain the plan to you. Yes, as said here, so we didn't do a price change for 15 years, and to be honest, we didn't even really consider to do it. So we just kept working on making the engine more reliable, more powerful. We're happy with the feedback that we've gotten. We believe we've brought the whole thing from a pre-flight tool, a PDF analysis tool with a few correction capabilities and color conversion capabilities to a more or less complete PDF engine when it comes to pre-press requirements. We believe that it's the case. We can see that at least many of our customers, I know that also by just looking at customer names and looking at what printers and advanced printers, online printers are around, that many at least of the advanced automated workflows are using our technology, and that our technology actually is an essential part of their production. Our aim is, or was in this 15 years and still is, to deliver the best PDF technology when it comes to prepress automation. And looking at the whole thing, how it stands today, there are scriptable process plans. There's a flexible API that can use variables. There's JavaScript. There are advanced features that go far beyond pre-flight or correction. You can generate a bleed, or you can generate a white form, or derive a white form from what you have. You can create a die line, you can extract the die line, you can place content, and many, many more things. And some of these features are even based on third-party components that we've integrated, for which we have to pay royalties, and that was never reflected in the price. I'm just saying that for whatever reason, we just got the feeling now is the time to adjust. So the price is, from our view, not just the correct price anymore. Of course, we've discussed with partners, and nobody really said, okay, you're wrong with your estimation here. The thing has evolved dramatically, and the price is just not the right price anymore. So, and that brings us to the plan.
So it's important to realize which products are implicated, and then we are talking about pdfToolbox, all of the different flavors of pdfToolbox, and pdfAPilot and the flavors of pdfAPilot. We are also talking about the maintenance contracts that are connected to those. And that is always the case. The maintenance contracts are a percentage, 20% of the price of the software. So if the price of the software increases, so will the maintenance contracts. What is also important is to note the things that are not affected by this, and that everything that is not on this slide will not be affected. Yeah, and that includes primarily license server, which is a relatively new product, and the price for that was set only a couple of years ago and is still correct, I believe. It also does not include PDF chip for the same reason. It's a relatively new product for which we looked at the price not so long ago, so those things are not going to change. And then the details, I just put the numbers on here, but only of the basic things. We're mainly talking about pdfToolbox, so I restricted myself to the pdfToolbox pricing, and I have not included all of the variants here that you have, because pdfToolbox comes with quite a few variants that around the main product. But in general, the other variants, the price increase will be in line with what you see here. For example, if you buy 5 versions of pdfToolbox Desktop, then there is a slightly decreased price because you buy 5 units. That also gets a little bit more expensive, in line with the more expensive price of pdfToolbox Desktop itself. Yeah, and then last, but still very important, when does this all happen? The 2 most important dates are on your screen. The first one is the change of the license price itself. And what that means is, as long as you buy software before May 1st, then you will still pay the old price. Starting from May 1st, you will pay the new price. Now, the question is what happens on May 1st, but that's simple, because May 1st is a national, it's not a national, it's a bank holiday in Belgium. So nothing is sold on May 1st. So be careful with that. But so from May 2nd on, you will pay these new prices for the pdfToolbox product. The other important date is July 1st. when the summer holiday starts, at least over here, the SMA price, so the maintenance contract price, will change for existing customers. And what that means is if you renew your maintenance contract, and that normally happens once a year, if that renewal is before July 1st, then you will renew at the old price, the existing price at the moment. If the renewal happens after July 1st, then the new prices will be applied to that as well. There is a way for maintenance customers to still remain on the old price for a while. Customers who renew before July 1st can ask to add 2 years to their contract, and then they will keep to the existing prices for those 2 years. If your renewal is after July 1st, then you can choose to renew for 3 years, and then you will also get a special price. I have not included the details there because for maintenance contracts, that's always very, very difficult. Sometimes there is consolidation that happens and so on. If you are in this situation, if you wonder what this will do in your particular situation for the price that you pay, then just get in contact. You can send email to info@callassoftware.com. You can email to info@fourpees.com or orders@fourpees.com. You can email just about anywhere and we will forward it to the right person. But just get in contact and we will explain how it is. If you bought this software through a partner, get in contact with the partner. They have already received all the details and they will be able to help you as well.
Good.
And I think that's it, right?
I agree.
Good. Then there is one question that we can maybe still quickly look at because we are, as always, way over time. But there was a question on the performance impact of Sifter, and I wonder if you've done any testing of what that was and what the improvement is with 0.1.
Yeah, I mean, that is really difficult because, but it's more than 50%. So I was using the more complex processing steps, demo files that came with the standard packagings, and of course these are quite complex. And the more objects you have, the more things the engine has to do with analyzing them in context, and of course, the more profit you from performance optimizations with caching. But there it was, I'm not sure, 50, 75%. It was significant. Yeah. I mean, meaning it was 75% faster.
Yeah.
That is my recollection. Yeah.
And I think at one PDF camp, shortly after Sifter was introduced, we did some testing on what the impact of Sifter itself was. Yep. If I remember correctly, for profiles that used a few Sifter checks, that was something like 10% or something like that, but it could go up to 3 times the processing time if you did very complex things.
Yep.
So I think here it is probably going to be somewhere in between that, and then you take the 50 to 75% into account that you say for the performance improvement. So yep. There's definitely an impact. I think that is that is for sure.
Yeah. Definitely. It's huge if it's relevant. So if there is not much that you will have to check to, then of course the performance is already quite okay. But you're right, and I also remember that PDF camp where we did these tests, and we basically said that it's not advisable to use object as visible in each and every check throughout a complex profile because it will just take too long. And as I've said, so you could consider to do that. Of course, it will make setting up your profile more complex, but performance-wise, of course, you will still see something, but not as much as you've done until 13.1.
Yeah, and the other part of what we said then at PDF Camp, and what I think is still, at least my understanding of the situation, is that it is good to look at performance because it's important how long these pre-flight runs take. But you have to keep in mind, you have to put things in perspective, and you have to keep in mind that false positives take a lot of time in workflows because the files are kicked out of the automated workflow and they have to be looked at. And that is a significant effort. It's not just time that the software runs on it, then you're also implicating labor from people that have to deal with these files. Even if it would take 10 times longer to run a profile with these checks, if that can reduce a significant amount of false positives, I am still convinced that that would be a good trade-off, because interrupting an automated workflow is much more expensive than having the software run a little bit longer. You do have to think about this in time-critical workflows. I think that's the essential part, is seeing whether a workflow is really time-critical. And if it's really time-critical, then I would look at sifter use in more detail and see whether it's really necessary. But to be honest, then I would probably also look at which parts can I replace by quick check, perhaps, that is even more fast than the pre-flight engine, and maybe some other optimizations. Yeah, so there is an impact. I think that the impact of losing automation is always going to be more, it's more annoying. Let's put it that way.
Fully agree. And also, just for your feeling, maybe you saw me applying the profiles on this PDF file. I mean, I admit it's not an overly complex PDF file, but it's some PDF file, and I think nobody really thought, okay, is the damn thing slow? So it just works, I guess. So it's up to expectations, I'd say.
So for all of you out there, test it, use it in practice. If you have experiences one way or another, reach out to us. We always like knowing what the software does in real life and real production. If you think there are things that are slow, tell us about it. If you think everything is fantastic, tell us as well. That is also always nice. But 13.1 is out there. You can download it. In fact, if you're running pdfToolbox, you should have gotten a notification about the update, and you should have already installed it, maybe. So test it and see what it does. Yeah. And then maybe a very good closing question from Dwight. Does PDF Camp have a theme this year? Sometimes there is a real theme. Usually it's open to whatever you want to bring in terms of questions. I think realistically, we expect quite a few things around 13 points, whatever features. So the new things that were implemented in version 13. But you can bring whatever questions you have around PDF and pdfToolbox. Really.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are visitors coming probably more with the PFA background, but there are others where it's pretty clear that they are interested in JavaScript and these things. So I think it will be something for everybody. And as you know, Dwight, we are working in groups, so I think it should be possible to make this worthwhile for the whole 2 days.
For the people who haven't been there, one of the reasons that this is done is in Berlin is the fact that if at some point someone asks a question and the people who are at the event don't know the answer, which is already challenging because Ulrich will be there, Dietrich is there, I am there, typically Mark is there. So
Vincent will be there,
Vincent will
our
be there.
JavaScript expert. So
imagine that you come up with a question that can't be answered by those people. We are in Berlin, and it is quite easy to bring in one of the other developers from Callas and get expert knowledge. And I think we've actually done that in the past a couple of times. So it's a very good way of meeting the Callas people and making sure that they understood your feature requests, just saying. And there is a lot of expertise in the room and right around the corner in the Callas office that we can call in to work on things. So should be fun again. Cool. And then I think we are done. Only about 30 minutes later than I thought it would be, so that's still reasonable. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you for staying until the very end, even though it was an hour and a half.